Getting started with freehands on miniatures can feel daunting in so many different ways. Maybe you never got into illustrating on paper or never been much of an artist. Together with my friend Sebastian, I'm going to show you 2 different ways that you can try these freehand techniques on your miniatures without having any pre-known knowledge of how to paint or how to draw and illustrate yourself. Hopefully this video will inspire you to paint bravely and maybe try out a couple of freehands or 2. Hey friends, you're watching Squidmar Miniatures. I'm Emil and today I have a guest.
Hi, I'm Sebastian.
Sebastian you've seen before in the 4 Painters Challenge we did, and he's an amazing painter, and I brought him here today to show off some cool stuff.
Yep, so today we're gonna do some freehand stuff. We're gonna do one simple one where we just build up some textures and show you how to take it to the level that you want it. Then it all depends on the time that you put in and layers, and you decide yourself where you want to go with it. And then we're doing another one, a freehand skull, where it's a little more artistic style to it, but also there you can do it more advanced, or you can take it to the further step if you want.
And we're gonna start with to paint one of these wings from Morathi. From Age of Sigmar game. It's inspired by an artist called Kaha, and we have no idea if this is the way she's painting it, but Sebastian did some experimenting and he came up with this really cool technique that I think is easily accessible for most people to paint. We just jump into it.
Yeah,
let's go. So for the base layer of this, Sebastian had already airbrushed from a dark red to a dark blue on the wing. This is more just to give him a feel for where the transitions would be when he uses the ink in the future, but you can start with black or use whatever color as a base as you wish, as all of this will be changed later when we add some inks to color the different striations, or what we should call them. And for this paint job, we're only using 5 different colors. It's a blue ink, a purple ink, a deep red ink, and a sort of normal reddish ink. And the last color is obviously a white, and you'll see why in just a second. Since the white is very thin down, the first layer that you apply to the model will be very translucent. And this is on purpose because you want to be able to control the brightness on the different parts. So the recommendation is first to add just 1 layer all over the wing where you want to have it, to just create some general shapes. And then go back with the same brush, the same thin down paint, and add 1 more coat to the parts where you want it to be brighter, and maybe even go 3 times over some of the parts where you want it to pop the most. And this step isn't very difficult, it's mostly time consuming. So maybe put on a podcast or listen to an audiobook and just sit down and enjoy the process of painting these meditational oil spill stains on the wings. And to make things a little bit more interesting, I've increased the speed of these clips to get to the next steps a bit faster. One thing, however, that I want you to analyze when you see these images is where he places the highlights. On this specific wing, for example, you can see him making it brighter in the bottom parts of it and in the center fold in the most inner parts of the wing. And because we're going to repeat this process to create depth later on, after we added and glazed in the colors, it's quite okay to not be super careful and super detailed with the first layer and the first time that we do this whole process. And you can see that Sebastian is using quite a small brush for this and thinning down the paint quite a lot. But really you don't have to limit yourself to using a small brush like this, for example. You can go ahead and use whatever brush you have at home. What is important, however, is that you have a brush with a good tip and that the reservoir can keep a lot of paint in it, so it doesn't dry out directly. And now that the patterns are done, we start glazing in some of those inks. And again, he thins down the inks the same way as he did with the white, but This time he's not adding it in a certain pattern or anything like that. He's adding it quite wildly. You don't have to be too careful in this step. You can be a little bit more messy, doing wet blends with the inks, starting with the red and then the deeper red, then the purple, and then go over to the blue. Because the whole idea with this is that we add the colors in layers, and when we started adding 2 or maybe even 3 layers, that's when the colors start looking good. You then have to make sure that the inks dry properly before adding another layer. We use the hairdryer to speed it up, but this makes the ink look very glossy. So if you don't have a matte varnish at home, let it dry naturally. So after 2 glazes of ink, it's time to repeat the process again. So we go back to the thinned down white paint again and make more patterns on the wings. The more times you repeat this process, the deeper the wings will look, because you will have the ink darkening the first layer of white the more times you repeat it. And the later layers will be brighter, obviously, because you didn't go over it with ink as many times. In this video, we're repeating it about 3 times, and when you do that, you kind of want to follow the original shape as you did the first time. But for the second and third lap, you want to be a little bit more careful when you add the highlights. You want the transitions to be a bit sharper and to make everything look a bit more coherent. If you, however, add 6 or 7 layers of this, you might want to do completely different patterns the first time and the 5th time and the 7th time. This will create a huge depth and create a large difference between the darkest ones that you did the first time and the final highlights that you did the last time. For the second layer of white, Sebastian is still using thinned down white paint and going through the same patterns again. And as you can see, he's focusing more on the center part, the most inner piece of the wing, to give it that sense of volume and depth that we want to have of the wings. He's not adding as much, he's not doing as thick of a layer as he did the first time, and then just repeating the whole part with adding the inks and then letting that dry. When you feel done with the patterns, you've done all of the different layers of inks and white that you want to have, it's time to do the final highlights. Sebastian is adding a little bit of the colors, the ink colors, to the whites and doing a super bright highlight with, I would say, maybe 90% white and then 10% of the color, and just going over the parts that he wants to highlight a little bit extra. And as you can see, he's focusing the highlights on the center of the wing again, and specifically on like the top part of each of these different patterns. And after a layer of matte varnish to remove some of that glossiness, we have these beautiful wings, and this is gonna look so freaking badass on the miniature. So that's the first one. You painted this in like 1.5 hours maybe for one of the wings.
Yeah, something like that.
So it's a little bit time consuming, but it's not too difficult if one have the patience to actually try it out and use the glazes and then do the oil washes afterwards. Give that.
Yeah, and you can decide whatever. You can do multiple layers, or you can do 2 layers or 6 layers. It's all up to you and what level you want to bring it to.
Yeah.
But
and one thing I think is really cool is how when you paint like the first layer and do the ink wash, and then when you paint the next layer and ink wash that, the first one becomes even darker. So you have these like layer upon layer look. They're really like, it's such a cool texture. So that's awesome. So what are we gonna paint now?
Now we're gonna do a skull, like a freehand skull thing. A little bit inspired by the coronavirus going around, the green and sick looking virus thing.
Yeah, and you found this reference that you had found from Google of a skull. We're not entirely sure which the original artist is, and you're going to try to paint something inspired by this, I guess. So we jump into that, and then we'll talk to you guys again afterwards. Painting a freehand that's more of an artwork rather than just textures seemed really daunting to me, or at least it did before I get to sit down next to Sebastian and see him paint. Hopefully this video will ease the fear for you the way it did for me. But what I found after watching Sebastian paint and sitting next to him while he's doing it is, number one, it has a lot to do with patience. Being patient, going back and forth with colors, and we'll cover that throughout this. And secondly, if you're not an experienced illustrator, you don't illustrate from the imagination all of the time, having a reference is so very important. Even unexperienced artists such as Sebastian, who's been working as a professional tattoo artist for years and years, had a reference next to him and looked at it all the time. Pretty much between every brush stroke, he looked at the reference and looked at certain details to see what to adjust to make it fit with his idea and the reference that he had. And the first step you're seeing in this painting process is Sebastian just creating the general shapes of the illustration. He's using a thinned down white and just going back and forth to create the base volumes that he's going to work from and add colors to later. This is similar to the foundation of building a house. It's just the base, it's not what's going to be visible in the end, but it's very important to have it to make sure that the base shapes are good when you come to the later steps. When we're done with the base shape of white, it's time to add in some shades. And Sebastian starts by adding a cool dark blue color to contrast the warm green ones that's going to be the highlights later. Contrasting a warm highlight with a cold shadow creates a feeling of a bigger depth in the artwork, almost like a deep blue ocean would feel deeper than just having a pitch black page, for example. And this is just the first back and forth between highlights and shadows and midtones to slowly build up something that in the end will look like a three-dimensional skull. It's time to start adding in the first midtones using some warped stone glow and just adding it on the remaining white parts of the skull. It's a thin glaze just all over the parts to get that base green tone to work from. And this is where the major back and forth works to make this piece come together. Sebastian starts adding in some of the moot green for the highlights. The color is still very thinned down and he's working in small increments, placing them where the highlights are on the reference and then just adding smaller and smaller areas of the moot green. And for every layer that he adds, the color becomes brighter and adds more of the highlight as well. And remember, be patient with this step because it's not going to happen over a few minutes. It's more of an hour-long process to go back and forth. So start by adding smaller layers of highlight, and when you've done that, you go back and forth again, adding more of it. Remember again to keep checking on your reference if you're not an experienced painter, and when you do that, you will in the end come to something that looks amazing. And another interesting thing that I found that Sebastian, when he does these freehands, like to work with a not too wet brush. Actually, the paint is somewhat dry in the brush as he works. That's one of the reasons why he selected a super tiny brush, because he actually prefers if he gets a little bit of textures from the brush rather than these super smooth transitions. So sometimes you can almost see him stipple the paint onto the miniature to get it to be removed from the brush tip. But then again, with a dry brush, I don't mean that it's super dry like a dry brush when you're painting like a dry brush. It's more like a not super wet, not a very damp brush. And sorry about the shifting and chasing focus on these clips. We accidentally turned on the autofocus and changed it back to manually, and you will see that the focus is a bit better in the end. And it's time to start adding in some of those brighter, poppier highlights. And do you remember that Dawn yellow that we added to the wet palette in the beginning? Sebastian starts adding in a few drops of those into the moot green. So it's not a clean yellow, it's a mix between the moot green and the yellow, and starts adding that to the smaller highlighted surfaces. And you can see that he's already starting to focus these to the smaller areas that's raised towards the sky, or the flat surfaces that are raised towards the sky. And in terms of values, these colors are still not super bright, but you can see what a huge difference they're making already because of the way that he placed the highlights and how carefully he blended between the shadows and midtones. And now guys, it's actually not a lot more techniques coming into this. He's just looking at his references, adding the details, and then going back and forth between colors to make the placement similar to those on the references. And be patient, guys. So to make this video get done faster, I'm going to speed up the video even a bit more, and then I'll talk to you a little bit more in the end when you can see the final process. So for the final step, Sebastian is just adding more contrast. For the deepest parts, he's adding the dark sea blue and maybe even a tiny bit of black to make it even darker. And for the highest part, he's adding more of that dawn yellow and maybe even mixing in a tiny bit of white as well. A final bonus tip here in the end from Sebastian, adding in a tiny bit of red as a complement to the green highlights that we have will be a great way of balancing out the work. And this red glaze that he adds into the shadows just makes everything come together a little bit more, and to have the shadows complement the greens a lot. So that's the painting process, I guess. Do you have anything special to say about the paint job?
Take your time to find some references so you know what you want to do, sketch it out, and then after that it's just time. You need to have the patience and put in the time that you need to build it up and go as far as you want. And you can take this even a further step, like do some inner glow thing or make it look like it's behind glass or whatever, but this is one way to do.
Yeah, I think the thing you did with the Wraith head, it was really cool that you added just like a layer of gloss varnish, and you got like it really looks like there is like a skeleton soul inside of the helmet, trapped behind glass. And one thing, as a viewer sitting here watching Sebastian paint this stuff, I've never tried it, but I'm super excited to try to do something like this, is how he looked at the reference almost after every brush stroke. And that was super cool to see that even for an experienced artist who worked professionally as a tattoo artist, that you still always reference to something else to see that it's still realistic and that it's looking good.
But it's a good thing to have your references so you know where you're going with it, instead of just trying to paint it from your head. And especially when you do realistic stuff like skulls, or let's say we do a portrait or whatever, you need to have that reference photo in front of you.
Yeah, that's such a good idea to print out the paper, or if you have like a photo printer or something at home, to find good references and print them out and have them in front of you at all times, so you can always go back to it, because our mind tend to deceive ourselves of how we remember things. So I guess that's it. Or do you have something else?
No.
Yeah.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and don't forget to go follow. Don't forget to go follow Sebastian on Instagram on Nero _Miniatures.
Yeah.
Nero Miniatures. And if you want to see his tattoo stuff, it's Nero Sin.
Yep,
Yeah,
exactly.
I'll put both of them in the video description if you're into, of course you're into it, go follow him. So guys, if you enjoyed my videos or this one in particular, don't forget to leave likes to help these videos spread to more people on YouTube. Feel free to leave comments in the comment section. I always try to answer to as many as I can, and I think Sebastian will try to respond to as many as he can as well. Subscribe if you want to see more videos. I release one every week. If you want to support this channel even more, there's a couple of ways you can do that. I have Amazon links on my website, squidmar.com, where I list all of the gears that I use on a daily basis. If it's brushes, paints, airbrush, lights, the microphone and everything like this. If you follow any one of those links, Amazon kicks a bit of money back to this channel. So that's a great way of supporting us. If you want to support us even more, I have a Patreon campaign where you as a viewer can pitch in a few dollars to make sure that I can keep running this channel and making these videos every week. And if you do, you get to join me and different Patreon supporters on a Discord chat where we talk about miniature painting, games, life in general, and just have a good time. Massive shout out to my top Patreon supporters: Joshua Crowther, Chris C, Robin Svensson, Jess Goldswain, Mark Lober, Mark André Richter, Russ Prentice, and Daniel Santos. So with that said, friends, have a great day.